Welcome back, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into a fascinating story, the miracle of the man born blind, from John chapter 9.
It's an amazing story.
It is, and we have R.C. Sproul's John, an expositional commentary along with us to guide us through it. And what makes this miracle so interesting, I think, is that it's not just about, physical healing. It really kind of gets into, what do we believe about suffering? What do we believe about sin?
Right.
What's the nature of Jesus's ministry, really?
Yeah, and the healing at Bethesda, this miracle immediately sparks controversy. John, it seems like, deliberately places these two events together to highlight the growing tension between Jesus and the religious authorities. It's almost as if John's foreshadowing the conflict that's coming.
And it all starts with a question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You have the disciples. They see this man who's been blind from birth, and their first reaction is to ask Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents that he was born blind?
Right.
Seems like a kind of natural question maybe, but what does Sproul say about it?
Yeah, well, Sproul points out that their question reveals a common misconception that a lot of people have held throughout history. This idea that suffering is always a direct result of sin, personal sin. He calls it the either-or fallacy, Like it's this or it's that, it must be one or the other.
Yeah.
And he says they're presenting a false dilemma by assuming that it must be either the man's sin or his parents' sin that caused this blindness. They don't even consider any other possibilities.
Okay, so this is where it always gets tricky for me because, we know from Scripture that sometimes sin does have consequences.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right? Look at David's adultery with Bathsheba.
Yes.
Led to the death of their child. You have Miriam, who was struck with leprosy for criticizing Moses.
Yeah.
And Sproul even shares that personal anecdote about his father, who believed that a stroke he suffered was related to not tithing 1 year.
Right. Yeah, and Sproul acknowledges that there are these instances where suffering is tied directly to sin.
Right.
But he cautions against applying that universally.
Right.
He uses the example of Job, of course, who suffered immensely even though God calls him a righteous man. Job's story, if anything, explodes that simple equation of sin equals suffering.
Right. So then how do we make sense of suffering? Especially when it seems so, random and unfair.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an age-old question. And Sproul emphasizes that we have to remember that suffering can have multiple causes.
Okay.
It can be the consequences of our own sin or the sin of others.
Right.
It can be a result of just living in a fallen world where bad things happen.
Yeah.
And very significantly for believers, it can be part of God's refining process in our lives, shaping us into the image of Christ.
Yeah. And what I thought was so powerful was when he talked about his friend Harvey,
who
had cerebral palsy. And, people would tell Harvey that his condition was due to a lack of faith or some hidden sin. They were essentially saying, well, the reason you have cerebral palsy is because you don't have enough faith, or, there's this secret sin in your life.
Yeah.
And it, only added to his suffering.
Yeah. Sproul uses that anecdote to show the dangers of misinterpreting the cause of suffering. It's not our place to judge or make assumptions about someone else's hardship.
Yeah.
I think we need to approach suffering with compassion and humility.
Right.
Recognizing that we don't always know the reasons behind it.
Yeah, we're not God, right?
Yeah.
We don't see everything.
That's right.
So the disciples' question and Sproul's response, they really set the stage for a deeper theological conversation about sin and suffering.
Yeah.
But then Jesus says something that kind of completely reframes the entire situation.
Totally.
He states that the man was born blind, that the works of God should be revealed in him. That kind of shifts the focus, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not about punishment. It's about purpose.
It really does. That statement's pivotal, I think, in the story because Jesus is declaring that this man's blindness is not arbitrary punishment or a result of sin, but it's actually an opportunity for God's power and glory to be displayed.
I don't know if you ever thought about that in your own life.
Sure.
Maybe there's a time where you went through something really difficult.
Oh, yeah.
You experienced hardship, but it ultimately led to something good.
Absolutely.
You can kind of look back and be like, wow, okay, God really used that for his glory.
Yeah, I think that's a profound insight, because it encourages us to see that even in the midst of suffering, God is working. But then Sproul points out something else.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, and that's the method Jesus used to heal the man. He uses spit and clay.
Right.
Why do you think Jesus chose that?
You know, it's so different from the other miracles that we see. I mean, he turns water into wine instantly.
Right.
He raises Lazarus from the dead with a word.
Mm.
But here, he takes the time to use spit and clay, as if he's, going back to the creation account and forming something new.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
It is interesting. And Sproul speculates that there's a symbolic significance to this act.
Mm.
This man was born blind, and so Jesus, using the substance from which humanity was formed, clay,
Right.
might be signifying a new beginning, a fresh start.
Oh, wow. That's huge. That's really interesting. So
Yeah.
it's like he's saying, I'm not just going to heal you. I'm going to, recreate you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's this reminder that God can use, these ordinary elements of creation, right,
Yeah.
to accomplish really extraordinary things.
That's right. And then Jesus tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And Sproul reminds us that God often works through what theologians call means, using natural processes or human actions to bring about his purposes. Think of the parting of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
God used the wind to divide the waters.
Right.
Or even think of, planting a seed to grow a flower. You're using something physical
Right.
to bring about something new.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because now we see kind of like the ripple effect of this miracle.
Yeah.
And people start reacting in different ways.
Yeah.
Right? You have some who are just amazed by this healing, but then you have the Pharisees. And they're more concerned with the fact that it happened on the Sabbath than, the fact that this miracle took place.
Yeah. Their reaction is really telling, I think. Instead of rejoicing at this amazing miracle, they get hung up on the technicality of it happening on the Sabbath.
Right.
Their legalistic mindset, as Sproul points out, blinds them to Jesus's true nature
Yeah.
and the power of what he's doing.
They can't see the forest for the trees, right?
That's right, yeah. They're so focused on the rules that they miss the Messiah
Right.
standing right in front of them.
Yeah. It's really kind of a tragic thing.
Yeah, it is. And it's not just the Pharisees who are reacting out of fear.
Yeah.
The healed man's own parents are afraid to even acknowledge what Jesus did.
Wow.
They're worried about being ostracized by the synagogue. They're placing their social standing above the gratitude for their son's healing.
Wow. That's really something. I mean, it kind of makes you think, doesn't it? Would we have the courage to stand up for our faith if we were in a situation like that?
Yeah.
Even if it meant being rejected or ostracized.
It's a good question. It's a challenging question. It highlights the cost of discipleship.
Yeah.
But in the midst of all this fear and skepticism, we have this healed man himself.
Right.
And he may not fully understand who Jesus is yet, but he keeps repeating this one powerful truth: I was blind, now I see.
It's so simple, but it's so powerful, right? It's that's his starting point.
It is.
It's this profound statement of fact.
Yeah.
And leads him on this journey of trying to understand who Jesus is.
Yes.
But Sproul makes this interesting distinction here.
Yeah.
He says that simply bearing witness to what we've experienced isn't the same as preaching the gospel.
That's right.
So, I mean, what's the difference there?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think it's a crucial point.
Mm.
Bearing witness is sharing what we've personally seen and experienced.
Okay.
Like the man saying, I was blind, now I see.
Mm.
But preaching the gospel is proclaiming the full message of salvation, who Jesus is, what he accomplished on the cross, and how we can receive his gift of forgiveness and eternal life.
Yeah. So we need both, right? We
Yeah.
need those personal, I was blind, now I see moments, right?
Yeah.
To kind of connect with people, but we also need a really solid understanding of the gospel message.
Yeah.
To really share the hope that we have in Christ.
Absolutely. And Sproul emphasizes that this requires intentional study and engagement with the scriptures. We can't effectively share what we don't understand ourselves.
That's true. That's so true.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting back to the story, this is where we see the healed man's understanding of Jesus start to evolve.
Right.
It's almost like his physical sight was restored instantly, but his spiritual sight is kind of slowly becoming clearer as the story unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
And the Pharisees keep pushing him, right?
They do.
Trying to discredit Jesus.
Yeah.
But he doesn't back down. What stands out to you about his responses?
I think what's remarkable is his boldness. He's just a regular guy.
Yeah.
He was ostracized. He was marginalized his whole life because of his blindness. And yet He stands up to these religious leaders,
Right.
these men of authority.
Yeah.
He even points out their hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
He says, no one has ever healed a man born blind before. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.
Right.
It's like he's saying, I may not have all the theological answers, but I know what I've seen, and I know that this man's from God.
It's like his experience trumps all their arguments.
Yes,
Wow.
and that simple faith infuriates the Pharisees
Right.
to the point where they throw him out of the synagogue.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
They reject the very man that they claim to care for.
Right.
Their legalism has blinded them to compassion and to truth.
That rejection, though, kind of like paves the way for this really personal encounter between Jesus and this outcast man.
Yes.
Jesus seeks him out, right? The one who's been rejected and marginalized, and asks him directly, do you believe in the Son of God?
Yeah.
It's such a tender moment.
It is. And notice the man's response. He doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He simply asks, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? He's honest about where he is in his journey,
Right.
and he's eager to learn more. He has this incredible openness to truth.
And Jesus meets him right where he is.
He does?
He says, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. Imagine that moment. The man who was once physically blind is now seeing Jesus face to face, and he recognizes him as the Son of God.
Right. It's such a beautiful illustration of how faith is often built upon experience. The man witnessed Jesus's power through the miracle,
Right.
and then he encountered his compassion and love through this very personal interaction.
Right.
And that's when true belief takes root, not just as an intellectual concept, but as a lived reality.
And it's not just intellectual assent, it's like this wholehearted surrender.
Yes.
And the man falls down and worships Jesus.
Yeah.
It's not just that he's acknowledging Jesus' authority. He's offering his entire being, like, in adoration and gratitude.
Yes.
It's this profound transformation,
It is.
like from physical sight to spiritual understanding and ultimately to worship.
And Sproul emphasizes how this progression often mirrors the journey of many believers. We might start with these glimpses of God's power or goodness, like this man's healing. And those glimpses, they draw us in, leading us to a deeper faith and ultimately to worship. Have you seen that in your own life?
Yeah.
Times when God has revealed himself in a way that has led you to a deeper understanding of who he is.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a powerful question to reflect on. It makes me think about all the ways that God has been at work, even in the midst of really hard things.
Yes.
But the story doesn't end with the man's worship. Jesus then makes a statement that kind of seems a little paradoxical. He says, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. What's he getting at there?
Yeah. That's a statement that demands careful consideration. I think it's important to understand that Jesus is speaking about spiritual sight,
Okay.
not just physical sight. He's saying that his coming into the world exposes the true condition of people's hearts.
So it's like a dividing line almost.
Yeah.
His presence reveals who is truly open to God and who's kind of resistant.
Yes.
Who's willing to be humbled and who's kind of clinging to their own understanding.
Yes, exactly. Those who are humble, those who recognize their need for God, they will see Jesus for who he is, and they'll embrace his light. But those who are proud and self-righteous, those who think they already see the truth, they will actually be blinded by their own arrogance.
It's almost like they're so convinced of their own rightness that they can't see the truth, even when it's right in front of them.
That's right.
It's such a stark contrast to this healed man who is willing to admit, I don't know who the Son of God is, but I want to believe.
Yes, and that's precisely Sproul's point. True faith, he says, begins with humility, with recognizing our own limitations and our need for God's grace. The Pharisees, in their pride, had become blind to their own blindness. They couldn't see their need for a savior because they thought they already had all the answers.
So this miracle, the story of the man born blind, it's not just about physical healing. It's this powerful metaphor for the spiritual condition of humanity.
Yes, it is. It's a reminder that we're all born spiritually blind, and it's only through Jesus that we can receive true sight. And the irony is, as Sproul points out, that those who think they already see, those who cling to their own understanding, are the ones who remain in darkness. And this raises an important question for us. What kind of blindness might we have in our own lives that prevents us from truly seeing Jesus?
Oh, wow. That's a big question.
Yeah.
That's something to really think about.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's so easy to think, oh, we got it all figured out, our perspective is the right one. But this story really reminds us to always check our hearts.
Yeah.
For those blind spots, where pride or self-righteousness might be blocking us from truly seeing Jesus.
It's like, we can be surrounded by evidence of God's grace. We can hear incredible testimonies. We can even be actively involved in a church
Hmm.
and yet still miss the point.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. And that's why Sproul emphasizes the importance of humility, as a foundation for true faith. I think we need to approach God with a sense of wonder and awe, you know? Recognizing that we're these finite beings trying to grasp an infinite God.
Yeah.
We're never going to have all the answers,
Right.
but that's okay. In fact, it's in that posture of humility, admitting that we don't have it all figured out, that we actually become open to God's revelation and transformation.
So how do we cultivate that kind of humility? Is it something we can just choose to do, or is it more of a process?
I think it's both.
Hmm.
I think we can make a conscious choice to approach God with humility, to acknowledge our limitations and our need for his grace. But I also think it's a process that happens over time
Yeah.
as we spend time in his word, in prayer, you know. And in community with other believers, we learn to rely less on our own understanding and more on his wisdom and his guidance.
I love how this story highlights that it's okay to have questions,
Mm-hmm.
to not have everything figured out. The healed man didn't shy away from his lack of understanding.
Right.
He asked, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?"
Right.
And Jesus met him in that place of honesty and seeking.
Yeah. There's so much grace in that exchange. Jesus doesn't condemn the man for not knowing. He welcomes his questions and reveals himself in a way that the man can understand.
Mhm.
It reminds us that God is patient with us in our process. He doesn't expect us to have it all figured out overnight. He gently guides us step by step as we grow in our faith.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into John 9 and Sproul's insights, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will glean from this story?
Yeah, I think one of the most important takeaways is this need to examine our own hearts for any blindness, really, that might be hindering us from truly seeing Jesus.
Mm.
Are we holding on to cherished beliefs or assumptions that are actually keeping us from experiencing the fullness of his grace and truth? Or are we so focused on, rules and regulations that we've missed the heart of what it means to follow Christ?
It's so easy to fall into that trap, especially today.
Yeah.
With so much going on, there's so much noise,
Mm.
so many voices. It's so crucial to be intentional about cultivating that posture of humility,
Yes.
seeking God's truth above all else.
Absolutely. And we need to remember that faith is a journey, not a destination.
Mm.
It's this ongoing process of learning, growing, and being transformed by God's grace. Just like this healed man progressed from recognizing Jesus as a prophet to worshiping him as the Son of God, our understanding will deepen over time as we experience his love, study his word, and allow him to shape our hearts and minds.
It's an exciting journey,
Yeah.
full of surprises
Mm.
and unexpected turns. And just like he healed this man born blind, God is still in the business of opening eyes, both physically and spiritually. So just keep seeking, keep exploring, keep diving deep into the riches of God's grace. You never know what amazing truths he might reveal to you.
Yeah, and it's so easy, to be surrounded by evidence of God's grace, hear incredible testimonies, even be actively involved in a church and yet still kind of miss the point.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought.
It is, and Sproul really emphasizes the importance of humility as this foundation for true faith. I think we need to approach God with this sense of wonder and awe, recognizing that we're finite beings, trying to grasp an infinite God.
Right.
We're never going to have all the answers,
Right.
but that's okay. It's in that posture of humility, of admitting we don't have it all figured out, that we actually become open to God's revelation and transformation.
So how do we cultivate that kind of humility? Is it just something we can choose to do, or is it more like a process?
I think it's both. I
Yeah.
think we can make a conscious choice to approach God with humility, to acknowledge our limitations and our need for his grace. But it's also a process that happens over time as we spend time in his word, in prayer, and in community with other believers.
Right.
We learn to rely less on our own understanding and more on his wisdom and guidance.
I love how this story just highlights, it's okay to have questions,
Mhm.
to not have everything perfectly figured out. I mean, the healed man, he didn't, shy away from his lack of understanding. He asked, Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?
Right.
And Jesus met him in that place of honesty and seeking.
There's so much grace in that exchange, you know? Jesus doesn't condemn the man for not knowing. He welcomes his questions and reveals himself in a way that the man can understand. It reminds us that God is patient with us in our process, you know? He doesn't expect us to have it all figured out overnight.
Right.
He gently guides us step by step, you know, as we grow in our faith.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into John 9 and Sproul's insights,
Mhm.
what are some key takeaways that you hope listeners will glean from this story?
You know, I think one of the most important takeaways is this need to examine our own hearts for any blindness that might be hindering us from truly seeing Jesus.
Right.
You know, are we holding on to cherished beliefs or assumptions that are actually keeping us from experiencing the fullness of his grace and truth?
Mm.
Are we so focused on the rules and regulations that we miss the heart of what it means to follow Christ?
It's so easy to fall into that trap, especially today, with so much going on and so much noise and so many different voices. I think it's just so crucial to be intentional about cultivating that posture of humility
Yeah.
and seeking God's truth above all else.
Absolutely. And we need to remember that faith is a journey, not a destination. You know, it's this ongoing process of learning, growing, and being transformed by God's grace. Just like the healed man progressed from recognizing Jesus as a prophet to worshiping him as the Son of God.
Right.
Our understanding will deepen over time as we experience his love, study his word, and allow him to shape our hearts and minds.
It's an exciting journey. It really
It
is.
is.
You know, full of surprises and unexpected turns. And just like he healed the man born blind, God is still in the business of opening eyes, both physically and spiritually. So keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the riches of God's grace. You never know what amazing truths he might reveal to you.